Joining me now is Gerard Henderson, who is one of Australia's most formidable centre-right intellectuals. He and his wife Anne run the Sydney Institute, a forum for debate. He's written widely on the Liberal Party, but he's been at the coalface of politics, most notably as Chief of Staff to John Howard during the tough days of opposition when he was opposition leader against Bob Hawke. Gerard, welcome to the very first edition of the McGregor Angle, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, it's great to be on the first edition.
My great pleasure, thank you. Gerard, I want to put to bed one calumny that I think's afoot in the wake of the defeat of Trump. A lot of supporters, a lot in the media and a lot in the think tank are writing this government off, the Australian coalition government, as phony conservatives, linos, Liberal in name only. What's your view of where this government sits in the broad centre-right tradition?
Well, firstly, whilst I'm an admirer of American politics, the United States is a quite different society to ours. In relation to the Morrison government, if you look at the polls, if you get a sense of the feeling around, in extraordinarily difficult circumstances, the Prime Minister, Mr Morrison, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and other senior ministers and with the support of the Nationals, that is the Liberal Party, have done extraordinarily well in economic circumstances as difficult as anything Australia has suffered since the 1930s, the Great Depression of the 1930s and the way out of that. So you have to say that this government has been successful, and one of the tests for that is that Labor's having trouble adjusting, so if the opposition's having trouble adjusting to the government, you have to say that the government's doing well. Now, I think there are a number of critics of the government. Some of them have never worked in government or in opposition and probably don't understand just how difficult it is. But those of us who have, and I know you have on the Labor side, but those of us who have understand the enormous difficulties of holding your colleagues together, which is Scott Morrison's task, then holding the coalition together and getting as much of the country as you can to support you. Along the way, you're going to upset some people, but if you can keep doing as I know the Prime Minister looks back at, he's in touch with John Howard, the long-serving Liberal leader. He's a great admirer of the late Robert Menzies, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. And he looks back with inspiration on what Joseph Lyons did, the Tasmanian who left the Labor Party, joined the main Conservative Party at the time, what he did through the 30s in bringing about Australia's recovery, which, along with Britain, was probably the best in the Western world at the time. So these are difficult times, but I think the government's handled it pretty well. There'll always be people upset. Everyone makes mistakes, but it's pretty successful. I don't think it warrants the criticism that it's getting from some commentators.
Indeed, and you've pointed to an intellectual curiosity on the part of this Prime Minister as well, because you know the tagline, Scotty from marketing is the term that's used to derogate him, but he clearly has an intellectual core and he's got values, and you've situated him as a mainstream figure. Just for the audience, many of whom post-date us, but I'm assuming you'd say that Robert Menzies and John Howard would not have quibbled at taking the necessary measures this government's taken in terms of expenditure and foregoing surpluses to achieve what it's achieved. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, both were politicians of principle, but both were pragmatic politicians who knew that you had to adjust to the circumstances. Menzies did that, Howard did that. That's why they were number one and number two longest-serving Australian Prime Ministers. So I think in that regard, that's what they had to do. And I think I think John Howard or Robert Menzies or Joseph Lyons facing a similar situation would have adopted similar kind of approach in different circumstances.